April 3, 2003. Darkness still blankets the flatlands outside Baghdad, but at the edge of the city, something enormous and terrible is waking up. Engines rumble like an approaching storm. The air smells of diesel, cold metal, and a tension that has nothing to do with weather. At Baghdad International Airport, miles of runway, concrete aprons, hangars, fuel depots, and fortified compounds, two very different worlds are about to collide. On one side, Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, mechanized infantry, artillery batteries, and attack helicopters. Trained units that move in coordinated, practiced patterns, backed by air power and precision munitions. On the other side, Republican Guard brigades, Fedayeen irregulars, anti-tank teams, T-72s patched with paint and prayer, and men who believe the runway is the last threshold between the invaders and the capital itself. Both sides understand the stakes. For the defenders, the airport is not only a strategic objective, it is a symbol, a last visible line of the regime. For the attackers, taking it is a key to Baghdad. What follows in the next 3 days is a concentrated, brutal microcosm of modern war, a mixture of technology and improvisation, doctrine and desperation, professional soldiers and men thrown together by circumstance. This is the story of that clash, hour by hour, position by position, and the human choices that turned runways into killing grounds and hangars into tombs. The build-up to those first shots is a story in itself. For more than a decade prior, Iraq had been shaped by war, embargo, and political isolation. The scars of the 1991 Gulf War, shattered armor, ruined infrastructure, and military lessons learned in blood run beneath the uniforms of both defenders and officers. When the U.S.-led coalition decided in 2003 to remove Saddam Hussein, it planned for a blitz, shock and awe from the sky, followed by fast-moving armored columns to fracture resistance and seize decisive points. Intelligence painted a picture of a brittle Iraqi command structure, units overstretched, and morale wavering. But intelligence also flagged the Republican Guard, a cadre of better-trained, better-equipped soldiers who could and would make stands that were costly and dangerous. Baghdad International, the airport that had been expanded and modernized in the 1980s, sat at the western flank of Baghdad. Its runways were long, its hangars were built for large aircraft. In the eyes of military planners, it was a choke point. If U.S. forces could seize the airfield intact and secure the routes into the city, they would have an operational hub for logistics and a psychological demonstration of control. The Iraqi view was uncompromising. Republican Guard units, some elements of the army, and Fedayeen irregulars were positioned to defend the airfield. Anti-tank teams were placed along likely approaches. Hangars were fortified, fuel dumps were concealed, and positions were prepared for close-in fighting. In many cases, the defenders were not mere conscripts, but fighters who had been in combat before, men who could use an RPG or a PK machine gun with deadliness born of repetition. April 3rd, pre-dawn. American units, elements of the 3rd Infantry Division among others, consolidated on likely avenues of approach. Hours were spent calibrating artillery, lining up target grids, checking thermal imagery, and coordinating close air support. The doctrine was combined arms. Suppress the defenders with artillery and air, then punch through with armor and infantry to secure key facilities. In training, this looks clean. In reality, the airport is a messy set of geometries. Taxiways that funnel vehicles, hangars that provide perfect ambush points, and concrete revetments that deflect cannon and shrapnel.
The first contact is close, sudden, and brutal. Anti-tank rounds find exposed armor. A T-72, camouflaged behind a berm, fires a shock of flame as it attempts to halt an advancing Bradley. and Abrams returns the compliment. A 120mm round finds the T-72, and the air fills with the smell of burning rubber and lubricants. Artillery impacts punch craters into asphalt. Aircraft drop precision-guided munitions on hardened points. The dawn is not gentle, it is punctuated by the drums of war. In close-quarters combat, the rules shift. The advantage air power gives is enormous. Sensors, guided munitions, and helicopter gunships can dominate. But those tools are less effective inside concrete hangars, across dispersal areas, and in the tangle of overturned vehicles. Infantry must clear building after building. Men crawl behind rubble, slide into doorways, and sweep with M16s or M4s. Rooms that once held engine parts or office desks become choke points where the next 2 minutes will determine who survives or dies. Medics keep a frantic rhythm, dragging the wounded between smoke and cover. Radios crackle with brief, clipped messages. Contact left. Tango down. Need a casevac now. And amid the technology and tactics are small human acts. A soldier wiping a photograph clean from his pocket before tucking it back in. An Iraqi gunner refusing orders to flee because the notion of desertion would bring shame. A medic muttering a name as he works. War is machinery, and it is also those human flickers. The first day is a series of pushes and holds. American forces press along taxiways and aprons, trying to create corridors for armor. Iraqi defenders counter with ambushes, firing RPGs from collapsed maintenance sheds and moving tanks to surprise positions. The 3rd Infantry Division's leaders attempt to string together a coherent advance, but the environment is fragmented. Lines of sight are short. What looks like open ground is a minefield of concealed threats. A Bradley becomes a coffin when a shaped charge finds its weak point. A soldier pinned down behind a crumpled vehicle watches tracer rounds stitch the darkness.
Night brings a separate terror. In the black, identification is nearly impossible. Tracer rounds and laser illuminations make silhouettes. A rusted fuel truck turned barricade becomes a grim landmark. Skirmishes flare like isolated storms. Snipers find angles. Defenders who can see the cracks in the American approach exploit them. The use of illumination rounds, flares, and white phosphorus in some instances creates a surreal tableau, an arid night painted in brief, lethal light. Radios carry the thin, tense sound of men holding on. By the second day, both sides have adapted. American commanders escalate their use of combined effects. Artillery is concentrated into timed missions. Air support is called in with greater frequency on known fortified points. Engineers push forward to create breach lanes. On the Iraqi side, T-72s that survive are repositioned under cover of darkness. Anti-tank guided missiles are moved like chess pieces, waiting for the moment when an American vehicle exposes its side. Fedayeen fighters, smaller, more mobile groups, launch sudden sallies, striking supply columns or isolated squads and then disappearing into hangars or concrete rubble. There are specific moments that will later be retold in veterans' memories. A squad leader orders his men through a door after a bang that echoes like a gavel. They find a maintenance bay where someone had been killed in a panic. A tank gunner sits on the edge of a disabled hull, smoking, staring at the horizon. An Iraqi epulator, once charged with maintaining aircraft, picks up an AK-47 and becomes a temporary infantryman, defending a fuel shed with a stubbornness that will later be described as either bravery or madness. The human cost becomes unmistakable. Casualties mount. Both sides recover bodies and attempt to count the lost. Equipment, tanks, armored vehicles, helicopters, is scarred and disabled. The airport's infrastructure becomes a casualty. Control towers pocked with shrapnel, hangars with collapsed roofs, terminal buildings with broken glass and bullet-riddled walls. An entire ecosystem that once supported flight is reduced to the rubble of conflict. At the tactical level, the battle is a study in micro-decisions. Which hangar to clear first? Who secures the fuel dumps? Which route will the supply column take? These choices are made rapidly and under duress. A misread of terrain or a radio that fails at the wrong moment can produce disaster. In one reported instance, a small convoy mistaken for an enemy column is engaged. Friendly forces suffer in the confusion of smoke and low visibility. The fog of war is literal and metaphorical here. Journalists and photographers attempt to document the fight, but the immediacy of frontline action and the restrictions of movement make a full accounting difficult. What filters out? The most dramatic footage, the photographs showing tanks burning on a scorched runway, shapes public perception. Yet even reporting is fragmentary. Official briefings will say the field was secured. Eyewitnesses will insist pockets of stubborn resistance lingered days later. Memory and record become dissonant. Beyond the immediate violence are the strange artifacts of war. Abandoned personal items in a shattered office, a child's toy on a runway, a pilot's logbook with entries cut short. These objects, hardly strategic, carry narrative weight. They are the small proofs that private lives bleed into public history. As the third day dawns, the fighting tilts toward a conclusion that is as much about attrition as it is about maneuver. American force posture, with its logistical depth, continuous aerial superiority, and the ability to bring fire to bear selectively, begins to win the calculus. The defenders, wounded by loss and diminishing supplies, find their ability to coordinate collapsing. Yet surrender is not clean. Some units give ground in stages, others fight to objects, a hangar, a revetment, a single tank emplacement.
There are instances of bitter last stands. An Iraqi crew refuses to abandon a disabled tank, continuing to fire until the ammunition is exhausted. A small Fedayeen cell stages a counterattack that throws an American element into temporary disarray, buying time for an older sergeant to drag a comrade to safety. American troops, for their part, display both the intense focus of trained units and the fatigue that accumulates in close combat. They move from adrenaline to exhaustion to a hollow quiet that follows heavy fighting. When the final objectives are taken, the airfield is a ruin. Burned-out hulks of vehicles dot the tarmac. A control tower leans like a damaged tooth. Fuel stains the ground in dark, sticky pools. Survivors sift through the rubble. On both sides, there is a mix of relief and a lingering, unspoken sense of loss, the very definition of victory complicated by what it cost. But the battle's effects go beyond immediate control of terrain. In the hours and days after, narratives begin to form. Commanders write after-action reports assessing tactics and logistics. Media outlets parse the details, sometimes simplifying them into a tidy arc: decisive U.S. victory, Iraqi hopelessness. Veterans form memories that will be retold for years, acts of heroism, near misses, and failures of command. For many Iraqis, the airport will stand as a symbol of the last organized resistance, a place of pride and pain. And yet, myths attach themselves to the dust. Stories of high-ranking officials crawling through the compound, of Saddam's direct involvement, of miraculous escapes, of atrocities, some true, some exaggerated, spread faster than corrected accounts. In the heat of collapse, rumor is an efficient weapon. Some narratives serve politics, others serve the need for meaning where chaos seems random. A careful historical view tries to separate the kernel of fact from the shell of myth. The battle did not determine the entire war, but it was decisive in tempo. It opened the road to Baghdad. That route, once secured, allowed coalition forces to apply direct pressure to the capital. In strategic effect, the fall of the airport accelerated the collapse of organized Iraqi resistance in and around Baghdad. But the collapse of a regime does not erase the personal costs. Lives were lost, families were shattered, Entire neighborhoods later felt the secondary effects of occupation and insurgency. The lessons the military drew from the fight are practical and often painfully specific. Urban combat, even on an airfield, is uniquely brutal. Close-quarters fighting neutralizes many advantages of technology. Logistics, fuel, ammunition, medical evacuation decide more battles than sometimes acknowledged. Coordination between aviation, artillery, and ground forces works when communications are reliable. It falters when radio networks fail. Engineers and intelligence units learn the value of careful route reconnaissance. Armored crews learn the dangers of exposed movement through constrained spaces. For soldiers and leaders, the experience becomes a case study in combined arms executed under stress.
But beyond doctrine, there is the psychological imprint. Many veterans describe a lasting reaction to the particular sights, smells, and rhythms of that fight. The eerie sound of tank rounds hitting concrete, the staccato of machine guns in an empty maintenance bay, the sudden hush that follows a medic's shout. These sensory memories become emotional markers that return in quiet moments, in dreams, in sudden flashes while driving, in stories told around fragile campfires in later years. Civilians connected to the airport staff, families of soldiers, local workers faced their own kinds of trauma. Those who survived recount walking through wrecked offices, crossing runways with burning fuel still smoking, and hauling water and food in desperate improvisations. The airport was a community in miniature, people whose lives were rearranged by the violence. Their stories remind us that war's geometry includes people, not just coordinates on a map. Internationally, the battle's images fed a media cycle that was hungry for drama. A burned-out tank on a runway, a smoldering hangar, a convoy moving toward Baghdad. These became shorthand images for a war that would be debated for years. They simplified complex tactical realities into digestible moments. That simplification influenced public perception of the invasion. Some saw inevitable liberation, others saw humiliation, cultural insensitivity, or tragic waste. History would later argue over the morality and wisdom of the war. The airport fight would remain as one of the more vivid episodes used to illustrate broader arguments. In the longer sweep of events, the fall of the airport accelerated the political unraveling of Saddam's control. Once the capital's approaches were breached and coalition forces could project power into Baghdad, the regime's ability to coordinate defense and civil order crumbled. Yet the immediate vacuum also produced new violence, looting, sectarian mobilization, and the rise of armed groups that would contest the post-invasion order. The airport's fall thus sits at an inflection point, decisive in the short term, consequential in the long. Return to the tarmac months later, and you will find stories lodged in the wreckage. A maintenance shed where a firefight raged, now a place where birds nest in the rafters. A runway scarred by shell craters, now slowly being patched. It seems a stripe of memory across the field. Old men might point to a burned vehicle and name the day it fell. Veterans will return, sometimes quietly, to see what remains of that place where young men on both sides tested the boundaries of courage. What is the human lesson in a fight like this? It is not a tidy moral. War is messy. Heroism and horror are braided together. Decisions that seemed right in 1 hour are judged harshly in the cold light of history. Yet amid the wreckage, individual acts of compassion, a medic risking himself to pull an enemy combatant out of the fire, a soldier sharing water with a captured opponent, a local worker sheltering a wounded man, suggest that even in the worst of moments, there are choices that preserve dignity. The battle for Baghdad Airport was not a single cinematic scene. It was hundreds of small scenes stitched together by geography, timing, and human will.
It condensed the mechanics of modern war, firepower, logistics, air supremacy, into 3 days of violent negotiation over asphalt and concrete. It revealed how doctrine meets improvisation, how trained units face determined defenders, and how memory, rumor, and history spin from the same events. When one draws a map of that battle, the lines are utilitarian: runways, taxiways, hangars, and revetments. When one draws the human map, the lines are pain, bravery, fear, and endurance. Both are real. Both matter. Years on, historians will argue over details: the exact number of casualties, the sequence of certain engagements, the presence or absence of particular commanders at specific times. Those debates matter for scholarship and for fairness to those who fought. For most who were there, the argument is simpler and more private. They remember lights and sounds and the person next to them who did or did not come back. Today, if you stand on that tarmac and listen, not to the roar of engines, but to the silence, you can still sense the old geometry of the fight. The airport is both ruin and witness. It testifies that modern war is as much about machines and doctrine as it is about human choices made in moments when seconds count. The battle for Baghdad Airport opened the road to a fallen capital, and in doing so, it left behind a complicated ledger of cost and consequence. War writes itself on metal and on men. The runways still bear the scars, the men bear the memories. Between them is a story that refuses to be neat, that will be retold and re-examined, that will keep asking the same question: what did we win, and at what price?